So in this video, I'm going to take a second look at this article that was published in the Times a couple of weeks ago now. I'd intended to make this video a little sooner than I have, but I've been very busy with finishing off writing and travelling around and doing various things, so I haven't had time, but I've got a little bit more space in my schedule now, so I'm hoping to make more videos with more regularity. So I have already made the first video in this series, which relates to child eye. And in this video, we're going to look at another claim made by the Thirlwall lawyers and that repeated here in this Times article. And this is in relation to child O, which you can see here. So this article, as I mentioned in the first video in the series, I don't think it's too harsh to say there's a very poor piece of journalism by Sean Linton where he's just repeating things that has been stated in a document submitted to the Thirlwall inquiry. He does kind of concede this, but he's also kind of implying that he's done some sort of investigative interviewing, or at least he's picked up the phone, which he clearly hasn't, because he's just quoting stuff straight out of the article, that the document that I've already responded to in a previous video. But I'll be doing that in more depth as well. That's a 173-page document. I will go through it all. I've just gone through the bit at the end where they try to claim that there are faults with the panel and faults with the panel's work and conclusions. That was very easily debunked, but obviously the longer document will take longer, but I will look through that as well. But this article refers to the end of that document where they make various claims, including this one about child O, which will be the subject of this video. I'll just read this paragraph briefly. The legal submission from the families claims that in the case of child O, one of triplet brothers born in June 2016, Letby's team changed the cause of death between a December press conference, where it was alleged the baby died after being injected on the wrong side, and the expert panel report that was submitted in February, where it was claimed that the injury was due to an extremely rapid delivery. Now, it really wouldn't take a huge amount of time to discredit that rather farcical argument, but in this video I'm going to completely annihilate it. So it will take a little more time, and I may even split this up into two videos, because I'd like to make slightly shorter videos than I have in the past. Ultimately what I'm going to do with this is put all the videos together as well to make one enormous video that can just be sent out as a single link. That's going to take a bit of time because there's claims about the infants that we need to go through as well. But in this first video on child O, I'm going to respond to this claim that the panel changed the cause of death between the December press conference and the later February press conference. So in December 2024, the original press conference was held in London, and the only person that spoke about child O, referred to here as baby O, was Dr. Richard Taylor. And this is what he initially said about it. We're going to go over his whole statement, but I just want to look at what he said initially first. My name is Richard Taylor. I'm a neonatologist from Victoria, British Columbia and Canada, but as you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from the UK. In fact, I trained at Barts, qualifying in 1980. So with regard to these reports, I've only read one of the reports in full, and that is the report on baby O. I should qualify this by saying that I have not seen the medical records myself, but I have read the full report. Now, there's two things to note here before we look into anything else at all. The first thing is, he has qualified this himself by saying, I did not see the medical records, I didn't look at the medical records, I'm just here, having read the full report, giving you a bit of a summary of that report. That's the first thing. That's obviously very significant in itself, because he's not making any medical claims about this, he's just recounting this to assembled journalists, essentially. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is possibly even more significant, is Dr. Richard Taylor isn't on the panel. He's not on the panel of neonatologists and other paediatric experts that has now been announced by Mark MacDonald, that's been publicised, that has been documented because we've seen the report and all their profiles are in there. Dr. Richard Taylor doesn't profess to be on the panel, he doesn't profess to have worked on this case, he doesn't profess to be involved in any way. He's just merely at this press conference, speaking in kind of an ambassadorial capacity, you might say. So that's the first thing. Now we're going to move on to the second part of this issue, which is the actual statement itself. So I'm going to read out what was said by Dr. Richard Taylor in December, and then we're going to compare that to the final report, and then we're going to go over some other issues. So Dr. Richard Taylor said, and to summarise the medical evidence, Baby O was doing reasonably well. There had been some concerns with abdominal distension, which is possibly related to excess gas going into the gastrointestinal tract. The baby had an apnea, and the medical staff, so just explaining here, an apnea is a pause in breathing. And the medical staff responded to this by intubating the baby, placing the baby onto a ventilator, and the baby was not unwell, and then put the baby on very high pressure settings. So in neonatology, when we ventilate babies, we ventilate by pressure rather than by lung volume. And this baby was placed on very high pressure settings, inappropriate for the fact that the baby actually had no lung disease at all. So the baby was being ventilated on very high pressure settings. Again, the nurses were concerned that the medical staff had actually left the unit. They then came back. Things didn't look quite right. And to summarise what happened, the nurse was again concerned that the abdomen was distended, and one of the doctors responded to this by placing a needle into the abdomen. So they directly aspirated the abdomen, and they chose to use a point which in medical parlance is called McBurney's point. This is a description of the point that is used for performing an appendectomy. The baby did not need an appendectomy. This is a newborn. Appendectomy is completely irrelevant to it. If an aspirate was going to be attempted, it should have been done on the left side. In fact, the doctor used McBurney's point, which is on the right side. As I've already said, the baby was on very high pressure settings, and this is confirmed by an x-ray of both the abdomen and the chest. And the settings were so high that the baby's liver was pushed right down into the pelvis, so when the doctor performed the aspiration of the abdomen, the needle perforated the liver. The baby was still being ventilated with a needle in the liver. The liver was now being lacerated by the needle, and this led to bleeding, free blood going into the abdomen. The baby went into shock. The shock was actually confirmed by a subsequent blood test, which showed that the baby's hemoglobin had halved, and they were unable to resuscitate the baby, partly because they didn't realise what they'd done. So there's a lot of information there, and I'm going to break all of that down shortly. But what I'm going to do first is look at the statement that was made in the summary report that has just been submitted recently to the Criminal Cases Review Commission and that was initially released in February. So this is the summary report that, as I say, was released in February. And this is the section for Child O, or Baby 15 as the panel named it. We're just going to look here at the conviction and panel opinion sections. I'll read the conclusion as well. It was initially alleged that Baby 15 received inflicted blunt trauma to the abdomen, causing purpuric discoloration and a ruptured subcapsular hematoma of the liver, and that air was injected into the nasogastric tube to cause gaseous distension of the intestines. Later, the accusation was changed to deliberate injection of air into his circulation. Baby 15 collapsed because the subcapsular hematoma ruptured, causing acute major hemorrhage into the peritoneal cavity, sufficient to cause a near halving of the hemoglobin level. Subcapsular liver hematoma is the result of traction or shear forces applied to the thin, fragile liver capsule through the hepatic ligaments. In Baby 15, this was highly likely the result of the extremely rapid delivery, which is a well-recognised cause of birth injury. Bleeding into a subcapsular hematoma is characteristically initially slow because it is contained by the pressure of the enveloping liver capsule. In these early stages, the clinical signs are insidious and difficult to recognise. High-pressure ventilation decreased venous return to the heart and contributed to liver congestion. The slow deterioration is then characteristically followed by acute collapse when the capsule ruptures, releasing free blood into the peritoneal cavity. The significance of the rising heart rate and falling pH before the terminal collapse were not recognised. The blind abdominal insertion of a needle during resuscitation may have penetrated the right lobe of the liver, causing further injury, noted by the pathologist as parenchymal hematoma, and laceration. Blunt direct trauma to the right abdomen or chest is implausible because it is very difficult to generate the kind of forces required to produce the observed injuries in a liver protected by the lower chest wall. The gaseous distension of the intestinal tract was likely due to air swallowing and insufflation during non-invasive respiratory support. The suggestion of injection of air into the circulation is conjecture. I think that's being polite, frankly. Baby 15 died from a subcapsular liver hematoma caused by traumatic delivery, resulting in hemorrhage into the peritoneal cavity and profound shock. This was not recognised ante-mortem. So what we're going to do now is compare these two statements and compare the details of the two statements, and also go through some fact-checking of what's been asserted during these two press conferences and in the submission of this final report. So I'm going to compare the two statements now that were made in December 2024 and February of 2025, respectively. And both of the statements begin by establishing some things that are uncontested. The December statement begins, and to summarise the medical evidence, baby O was doing reasonably well. There have been some concerns with abdominal distension, which is possibly related to excess gas going into the gastrointestinal tract. The baby had an apnea, and the medical staff, an apnea is a pause in breathing. Medical staff responded to this by intubating the baby, placing the baby onto a ventilator, and the baby was not unwell, and then put the baby on very high pressure settings. That's all uncontested, and similarly, in the statement from February, in the report, it stated here, it was initially alleged that baby 15 received inflicted blunt trauma to the abdomen, causing purpuric discoloration and a ruptured subcapsular hematoma of the liver, and that air was injected into the nasogastric tube to cause gaseous distension of the intestines. Later, the accusation was changed to deliberate injection of air into his circulation. Again, that is not contested. So we begin by comparing these two statements. So the paragraph that's written above is from the December press conference, and the paragraph written below is from the February summary report. So this begins, I'll read the December one first. So in neonatology, when we ventilate babies, we ventilate by pressure rather than by lung volume. And this baby was placed on very high pressure settings, inappropriate for the fact that the baby actually had no lung disease at all. So the baby was being ventilated on very high pressure settings. And then in February, the report says he was intubated and ventilated with high pressures. His ventilation pressures were increased to 32/6 in 100% O2. High pressure ventilation decreased venous return to the heart and contributed to liver congestion. So both of these are just very clear references to high pressure ventilation settings being significant. So next point I just want to highlight briefly is that the December statement by Richard Taylor includes this comment about the nurses being concerned that medical staff had actually left the unit. So this is symptomatic of this comment that was written in The Guardian. This is well known to be the case anyway, that there were 7 consultants spread between the neonatal unit and the children's ward with plans to recruit another 2. That's obviously indicative of understaffing. But the next sentence, relating to senior doctors only carrying out ward rounds twice a week compared with daily at other hospitals, that was a very significant dereliction of what should be expected on these units. I mean, I've spoken to many nurses that say this is unbelievable. I remember speaking to one neonatal nurse practitioner from the United States, and she actually knew a lot about this case and she provided a lot of information, but she didn't know this thing about the ward rounds. When I told her they were only doing 2 per week, I mean, she was apoplectic. She couldn't believe that would occur on a neonatal unit. So that comment made in the report is indicative of this general malaise at the Countess of Chester. So move on to the next part. Again, the top statement here is from December, comments from Richard Taylor, and this is from the February report. So I'll read the December comments first. So they directly aspirated the abdomen, and then they chose to use a point which, in medical parlance, is called McBurney's point. This is a description of the point that is used for performing an appendectomy. The baby did not need an appendectomy. This is a newborn. Appendectomy is completely irrelevant to it. If an aspirate was going to be attempted, it should have been done on the left side. In fact, the doctor used McBurney's point, which is on the right side. So that should be fairly clear. McBurney's point is obviously a slightly obscure medical reference, but we'll go over that briefly in a second. And then in February, it's simply written, the blind abdominal insertion of a needle during resuscitation may have penetrated the right lobe of the liver, causing further injury, noted by the pathologist as parenchymal hematoma and laceration. So very clear that there's this mistake being made on the right-hand side of the abdomen. So I just wanted to show this image briefly of McBurney's point. As you can see, it's on the right side of the abdomen, the left side as we look at it, but the right side of the patient. Then we move on to this comment that's made in December about the shock being actually confirmed by subsequent blood tests, which showed that the baby's hemoglobin had halved. Hemoglobin, of course, relates to the blood. In February, Dr. Shuley stated, baby 15 collapsed because the subcapsular hematoma ruptured, causing acute major hemorrhage into the peritoneal cavity that was sufficient to cause the hemoglobin to drop by half. In other words, half the blood was lost into the abdomen because of the rupture. Now, you should know that for all of us, if you lose 20% of blood volume, you will go into shock. So when you lose half your blood, this is a very major event. And of course, even more escalated and elevated for a neonate. So again, that just indicates both statements asserted that half of the blood was lost, according to evidence that was provided. So if you look at the statements in their totality, the original assertion that we'll go over again in a second was that the panel had somehow changed the assessment of death from December to February. But when you actually look at the statements, that doesn't stand up to any scrutiny whatsoever. We'll go back over the Times article now just so we can see what the original allegation is. So the Times article and the lawyers representing the family stated the legal submission regarding to Child O was changed. The cause of death in the December press conference, it was alleged the baby died after being injected on the wrong side, and the expert panel report that was submitted in February claimed the injury was due to an extremely rapid delivery. Now, as we can clearly see, in both the December and February submissions, this idea of being injected on the wrong side was clearly included in both. And in the expert panel report, there is reference to this extremely rapid delivery that relates to subcapsular hematoma that is very significant. I'm going to go on to discuss this shortly, but even just what I've provided there, the two key points obviously are that firstly, it's absolutely evident that the panel, this statement is demonstrably untrue. It's demonstrably untrue that the panel has changed their opinion. The second, obviously, key point is that Dr. Richard Taylor is not part of the panel. Not only is he not part of the panel, he made it clear that he hadn't worked on this case when he spoke in December, and he was just there in a kind of, as I say, ambassadorial role, essentially. So already, that statement now has absolutely no merit whatsoever. But we're going to go into some more aspects of Child O that are relevant in more detail as well. So I want to move on now to this aspect of the panel opinion here, which begins from this point here. Baby 15 collapsed because the subcapsular hematoma ruptured, causing acute major hemorrhage into the peritoneal cavity, sufficient to cause a near halving of the hemoglobin level. Subcapsular liver hematoma is the result of traction or shear forces applied to the thin, fragile liver capsule through the hepatic ligaments. In baby 15, this was highly likely the result of the extremely rapid delivery, which is a well-recognised cause of birth injury. Bleeding into a subcapsular hematoma is characteristically initially slow because it is contained by the pressure of the enveloping liver capsule. In these early stages, the clinical signs are insidious and difficult to recognise. So this is the source of the comment made in the Times article and by the lawyers about this extremely rapid delivery. Now, of course, this is significant because it relates to the subcapsular hematoma that is being referenced here. So I want to go over this in more detail and show the significance of this, because it's not something to be glossed over or just dealt with briefly. So the first thing to say about the subcapsular hematoma is that it's not a secret. I referenced these articles previously. This is the 4th edition of Private Eye, writing on the lessons of the Lucy Letby case. And in this paragraph here that I've highlighted, Dr. Philip Hammond writes, a plausible alternative for the clinical picture of liver damage from experts who have knowledge of the clinical records is a ruptured subcapsular hematoma of the liver, possibly compounded by resuscitation injury. These are well-known and well-referenced causes that should have been explained to the jury, but weren't. Now, we'll return to that final sentence in a second, or shortly. This is Private Eye Part 6. And in this paragraph here, we see a possible answer came later in the Tortoise podcast, Lucy Letby, the expert witness, in which a neonatal pathologist looked at the notes blind and determined it was more likely a subcapsular hematoma. This is rare but recognised and more likely after difficult premature multiple births. So this very critical aspect of the defence and of the conclusions of the neonatal expert panel has already been discussed well before they even convened. But there is a very good reason for that, as I will show you now. So I'm going to show you a document from the Thirlwall inquiry. This is INQ 0018008, pages 9 and 10 of document titled Level 2 Root Cause Analysis Investigation Report relating to child O, dated 23rd of June 2016. So this is an internal document from the Countess of Chester that is investigating issues with child O, problems that it experienced, and the reason for its passing after its short, so I don't know if the child's male or female off the top of my head, during the short existence of this infant. And this document references rupture of subcapsular hematoma due to prematurity. So this was well understood at the time by the hospital, by pathology, and yet this was overturned in court by Dr. Evans, as will be discussed later in this video. So I'll just briefly read this definition of a subcapsular hematoma out, because I've neglected to do that so far. It's simply a collection of blood beneath the capsule of an organ like the liver, spleen or kidney, and can be a serious condition, especially if it ruptures, potentially leading to life-threatening hemorrhage. Of course, as we know, and has been well established in these vulnerable infants, any such condition becomes elevated in terms of its risk profile. So the next thing to understand about a subcapsular hematoma is that the clinical signs are quite subtle, very subtle in fact. And this could be troubling and problematical for a unit such as the Countess of Chester, which has been shown to have significant skills gaps, aside from the kind of state of general chaos that was occurring at the hospital, and the unsanitary conditions, and the understaffing, and all the other problems that have been well documented and that I'll be discussing in greater depth in future videos. So even on a more competent and more functional unit, it's possible that this could be missed. But certainly on this particular neonatal unit, where it's clear that the practice generally was well below the standard required, it'll be quite easy to miss something like this. And one of the reasons for this is a question that I'm going to ask here. A subcapsular hematoma might not cause immediate symptoms, true or false. So if we type that into ChatGPT, it just immediately says true. A subcapsular hematoma might not cause immediate symptoms, especially if it's small or develops slowly. Early on, it can be asymptomatic or cause only vague discomfort. Symptoms may appear later if the hematoma grows, compresses the organ, or ruptures, potentially leading to pain, hemodynamic instability, or other complications. Now, the other aspect to this as well that I'll just briefly mention is that obviously a baby cannot communicate its symptoms in language. The only vehicle you have for understanding if there's anything wrong with a child of this age is observation, its clinical signs, it's possibly figures, but it's general indications from the infant itself and its anatomy and physical state. So if you miss these subtle signs, or if you're not experienced at picking them up, and what I've heard throughout this process of researching this case is that neonatal anatomy and the way that neonates develop is considered even significantly different from other babies. That's why it's a specialty. That's why you have to train for 3 years to become a neonatologist, even if you're a paediatrician. So it's quite possible that these subtle clinical signs can be missed at the Countess of Chester, which is why they haven't responded to the subcapsular hematoma, which is why the baby sadly passed away, which is why you have this report in the document from Thirlwall I've just mentioned indicating that that was a significant cause of death. So I'm going to ask another question here. Subcapsular hematoma might not cause immediate symptoms, but could lead to unexplained deterioration later, leaving medical staff puzzled by a baby's sudden decline. Is this true? Yes, that's true. A subcapsular hematoma, particularly in newborns or infants, can sometimes go unnoticed initially because it may not produce clear or immediate symptoms. However, it has the potential to cause serious complications later on, which can lead to sudden and unexplained clinical deterioration. Here's how that can happen. First, there's an explanation of what a subcapsular hematoma is that we've already looked at. Why might symptoms be delayed? Initially, the hematoma may be small and contained, not affecting the baby's vital functions. There might be no external signs, especially if there's no external trauma. What can go wrong later? Rupture. The hematoma can grow and eventually rupture, leading to internal bleeding, which is life-threatening. Hemoperitoneum, I believe that is pronounced. Why might medical staff be puzzled? If the hematoma wasn't initially detected via imaging or wasn't suspected due to lack of symptoms, a sudden deterioration can seem mysterious. Unless there's a high index of suspicion or an autopsy, in tragic cases, the cause might remain unclear for a while. So that almost gives a textbook indication of what has occurred at the Countess of Chester and the problem they've had with this subcapsular hematoma. You can see from that why this was initially flagged as being the cause of death and why it's now been cited by the panel in this February report. So I'm going to discuss an important side issue here as well. And this begins just by asking this question of what is the difference between a subcapsular hematoma and a subdural hematoma. So there's an explanation here about the differences between the two. Essentially, subdural hematoma occurs between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter of the brain, typically due to trauma, etc., etc. Whereas subcapsular hematoma is between an organ's capsule, such as the liver, spleen, or kidney, and the organ itself. So although these, they're both hematomas and they have very similar names because sub means beneath, but it's the capsular and dural aspects of the word that lead to these very different realities of what they are. Now, the reason I'm explaining this to you is because an acute subdural hematoma causes symptoms quickly within hours to days. So this condition is completely different to subcapsular hematoma. Now, I'm going to expand on that further still. So I'm going to ask the question here, is a subcapsular hematoma harder to spot than a subdural hematoma? Let me just type it correctly. Due to delayed symptoms and subtler clinical signs. Great question. Yes, in many cases, a subcapsular hematoma can be harder to spot than a subdural hematoma, and your reasoning about delayed symptoms and subtler clinical signs is on point. Let's break it down. So you see all this quite complex, quite specific explanation of why a subcapsular hematoma is tricky to spot and why it's much easier to spot a subdural hematoma. Typically more neurological and noticeable symptoms, easier clinical signs, whereas we see here with the subcapsular, it's beneath the capsular solid organ. Its symptoms are often vague and delayed. Its detections can be missed on an initial clinical examination. So these are reasons you can miss a subcapsular hematoma. So then I've also asked this question of, is subcapsular hematoma a difficult diagnosis? And ChatGPT concludes that it can be challenging to diagnose depending on the clinical setting, the size of the hematoma, the symptoms, and the imaging modality used. And I would also add to that the capabilities of the staff that are dealing with the situation. So again, it can be a difficult diagnosis due to non-specific symptoms, delayed presentation, the need for imaging, and differential diagnoses. So this is particularly significant. Small or early hematoma may be subtle on imaging, so you can easily miss it. And if there are no symptoms and if there's delayed presentation, then this can all be problematical. Now, high clinical suspicion. This is the bit I really want to highlight. High clinical suspicion is critical in recognising subcapsular hematoma. Now, there are several reasons that I'm highlighting this, but one I just wanted to discuss briefly is that when you're a layperson in a jury, in a court case, you are so reliant on experts that appear in court. Because 2 years ago, I might have been able to explain to you what a hematoma was. I would have had a stab at it, certainly, because I know about the etymology of words because I'm a writer, and I know the words hemoglobin, for example. So I might have been able to tell you correctly what a hematoma is. I'm not sure if I would, but I think I might have had a chance. I don't think most people will be able to do that, but I'm damn sure I wouldn't have known the difference between a subcapsular and a subdural hematoma. I might have been able to guess that they relate to different parts of the body, but whether I would have been able to get them correct, there's not a snowball in hell's chance. Let alone would I have known the differing clinical picture and that one is much easier to diagnose than the other. I mean, they sound like almost exactly the same word. You wouldn't, unless you were clinically trained, you wouldn't inherently know that there are such massive differences between the two. And that's where you're so reliant as a jury on experts coming in and giving you accurate information. Now, I'll return to that point in a second, but I just firstly want to look at this very important element of the court proceedings with this nurse, Sophie Ellis, giving evidence. She confirmed she was the designated nurse for Child O. Child P is not relevant at this point in time. She recalls Child O was reviewed towards the end of that night shift as he had quite a full abdomen. So that's the distended abdomen that we've heard referenced in both of the statements from December and February. The nurse recalls Child O was very stable that night with no concerns, and the only thing to report was a full abdomen. So what that tells you is they didn't suspect the thing. They haven't spotted the hematoma. This thing is developing into a life-threatening condition within this infant. And because it has these delayed symptoms that we've discussed, and because they might not present clinically in an obvious way, they just did not spot it. So finally, I'd just like to move on to the evidence of Dr. Evans from Child O. So I'm going to read the whole thing out to you, just so you can see how farcical it is. I have got the court transcripts for this infant, but I'm reading out this summary because it just very succinctly indicates what an absolutely ridiculous farce this court case was. Giving evidence on Wednesday, March the 15th, expert witness Dr. Dewi Evans told Manchester Crown Court he believed Child O was the victim of an air embolus in which gas bubbles block blood supply. Before we go any further, let me just remind you, this is already changing his diagnosis. So back in the initial statement that's published in the Times that the lawyers have made, they're complaining or they're criticising the panel for changing their opinion. We've already annihilated that completely. That's an unfounded statement, but their prosecution that they believe in, that they wish to buttress, that they wish to assert the legitimacy of, is based on this guy continually changing his opinions all over the place. So this is just one example. The retired consultant paediatrician said a small discoloured purpuric rash had been noted on the youngster's chest during his rapid deterioration on the afternoon of June 23rd. Dr. Evans said, I considered that the rash was consistent with child O having received an injection of air into his circulation, his blood circulation. So this is another. Was consistent with. Firstly, that's not even correct. But secondly, you cannot say that's diagnostic. With all the other clinical signs of this infant, to say that the child having a rash indicates that this child died due to an air embolism, a deliberate injection of air, when there's all these other clinical signs, is just an unbelievably ridiculous statement. My opinion was that child O's terminal collapse was him being the victim of an air embolus. I couldn't find any evidence where this could have occurred accidentally. I mean, it's just horseshit. It really is horseshit. Dr. Evans said it repeated the pattern, so they're just transferring this diagnosis over from child B, and in that case, they transferred that over from child A. Dr. Evans said it repeated the pattern seen in the case of child B, a twin girl, who also had a noticeable rash during her collapse, which she survived. Jurors were told Dr. Evans had concluded in an earlier report in June 2018 that the cause for child O's collapse was trauma to the liver. A hematoma, bleeding, had been found in the liver during a post-mortem examination. Dr. Evans said if there was a purpuric rash, little blood spots under the skin, there had to be a cause. It was indicative of direct trauma. He later learned from the police that the doctor who observed the rash had further explained it disappeared a short time after. So bear in mind again, he heard this from the police. It's not even direct. He didn't get this from the police have just told him, some doctors told us the rash had disappeared. He didn't see the rash. He didn't see it in the case notes. He didn't know this initially. I mean, it's barely even science. It's just almost hearsay. Dr. Evans said this made a big difference to the interpretation of the rash. If it's a purpuric rash, it will last quite some time, days, hours. So as I say, this is why I'm highlighting this critical issue of the jury needs to be given accurate, credible information. You can see the danger of them being given this kind of crap that's being served up here. But you can see that earlier on, Dr. Evans just discounts the idea that there could have been a hematoma. I'm not going to go over that part, but it just is absolutely farcical when we can see in documents from the hospital that there's a hematoma. All these experts who are just so much more credentialed and proficient than Dr. Evans, it's untrue, they come to the conclusion that there's a subcapsular hematoma. There's all these clinical signs that point to it. There's all these strange symptoms that are just absolutely nowhere near consistent with an air embolism, and yet still Dr. Evans is saying, Lucy Letby's deliberately injected air and that's why this child has died. So here I'm asking ChatGPT, is an air embolism a likely cause of a subcapsular hematoma? An air embolism is not a likely cause of a subcapsular hematoma. A subcapsular hematoma typically results from trauma, injury, or surgical procedures where blood accumulates between the capsule and an organ, etc., etc. An air embolism occurs when air enters the bloodstream, which can happen during certain medical procedures. So while both conditions are serious, they have different causes and mechanisms. So I also, just as a final aside, want to talk about sepsis briefly. So I found this it just happened upon it during the process of research that in this study, sepsis was associated with 62% of the cases with hepatic subcapsular hematomas. Now, child O was one of 9 infants in the Lucy Letby court case that was showing signs of infection and had suspected sepsis, which is yet another area in which sepsis is significant in this court case. Now, during the summing up in court, this statement was made. An examination of child O's abdomen revealed no concerns, and this situation was uncomplicated and ruled out the possibility of liver hematomas at that stage. Had there been one, child O would have had symptoms of deteriorating. But we'll remember what was said here. A subcapsular hematoma, particularly in newborns or infants, can sometimes go unnoticed initially because it may not produce clear or immediate symptoms. However, it has the potential to cause serious complications later on, which can lead to sudden and unexplained clinical deterioration. So let's compare the two statements. Had there been one, child O would have had symptoms of deteriorating. A subcapsular hematoma can go unnoticed because it may not produce clear or immediate symptoms. There would have been symptoms of deteriorating. It may not produce clear or immediate symptoms. So it's just a fundamental lack of understanding on the unit with regard to Dr. Evans assessing the clinical notes and in terms of what was conveyed to the jury. And finally, I just want to remind people that Dr. Evans has changed his mind, changed his opinion, changed his expressed viewpoint on numerous occasions before the court case, during the court case, and since the court case. Just a couple of examples here. This was initially a statement that was made at the end of the Channel 5 documentary that was screened, with Dr. Evans talking about air embolism being a recognised cause of collapse and death. His report included 18 references. All of these things are going to be addressed in future videos. I reject suggesting the skin changes in the affected infants were different to that described by Dr. Lee, blah, blah, blah. Just a load of shit, really. And then later on, he changed it to this. Babies were destabilised by air injection to the stomach, an opinion shared by the paediatric experts, blah, blah, blah. And then we see the letter to Channel 5 where he changed this diagnosis, talking about none of the babies being killed as a direct result of the injection of air, which was repeatedly cited throughout the court case. So initially, this Times article and the statement from the Thirlwall lawyers is criticising the panel for changing their opinion, which is not only demonstrably untrue, but the prosecution on which they're reliant. The lead prosecution witness has changed his opinion countless times, including at this late date of August 2024, which is, of course, after the court case concluded. So to summarise this video, we began by looking at this initial Times article and statements from the Thirlwall lawyers, which alleged that the panel of experts had somehow changed its mind between its December and February statements. I guess one thing I didn't actually analyse in this video is whether it matters, whether it had changed its mind. Obviously, we've completely annihilated the view that was expressed by the lawyers and expressed by the Times article. But I suppose a kind of follow-up question would be, does it even matter? You know, they hadn't released their final statement at that point. They released a final statement in February. Even if it had been different from the panel, from the press conference in December, would that really matter? Because ultimately, that is the statement that is going to be released, the report that's going to be released to the CCRC, which has now been released to the CCRC. That's now been submitted as part of Lucy Letby's application to appeal. So, does it even matter? But that's kind of a moot point, because as we established, firstly, the neonatologist who provided the December statement, Dr. Richard Taylor, made it explicitly clear at the time that he hadn't worked on the case notes for Child O, nor did he ever indicate that he was part of the panel, which of course he isn't. And then secondly, it's demonstrable that the two statements are very consistent with regards to the cause of death and are not significantly different, let alone as the panel supposedly changed its mind. The statement referenced by the Times article is referring to the cause of a subcapsular hematoma, which has been both cited by several neonatologists as contributing to the cause of death, and was even cited by the Council of Chester itself in internal documents from June 2016. It is likely that the Council of Chester missed this hematoma because its clinical signs are subtle. Dr. Evans asserted that Child O collapsed and died due to deliberate injection of air, which is scarcely believable considering the demonstrable clinical signs. Dr. Evans also ruled out the significance of a subcapsular hematoma and even its existence, having changed his view more than once. Not only did Dr. Evans do this, he cited an argument which is easily rebuffed by someone with no medical qualifications, i.e. me, using ChatGPT. Lord only knows what qualified physicians make of his utter bullshit. And this is probably why you've got so many coming forwards. I mean, I'm getting a clearer and clearer impression of what occurred in court from having researched my book, from having written my book. So I've now completed what is going to be close to the final draft. So it's been an 18-month process of researching and writing And of course, I'm starting to make these videos as well. And, I'm getting a clearer and clearer clinical impression of what occurred and learning more and more stuff about what was said in court. And of course, I'm reading more and more about what Dr. Evans said in court. It just becomes more and more absurd. Now, as I say, Lord only knows what it's like if you're a qualified physician, and then God only knows what it's like if you're a neonatologist who's done the 3 years training from being a paediatrician. There's no wonder people are coming forward from all over the world to be in this panel, because they obviously they've been pretty circumspect about criticising Dr. Evans, although there has been a few comments recently. I know when Sarah Napton interviewed some of the panel, one of them in particular said, I mean, come on, this guy's nowhere near the standard. He shouldn't have been in the court case, basically. But, I mean, it must be bemusing for doctors to look at the stuff that this guy is saying that is just so easily disproven. It's staggering for me, and obviously I came into this, I'd be the first one to hold my hands up, as I said previously, and say I wouldn't know the difference between a subdural and a subcapsular hematoma. I wouldn't have known the difference, but obviously I've learned a fair bit, and I do believe that you can learn anything if you put your mind to it. But people that have spent their lives in medicine, they just must be looking at this and thinking, this is like beyond a joke. It really is. And then finally, just mention there's a significant link between subcapsular hematomas and sepsis, and that child O was 1 in 9 infants in the case demonstrating clinical signs of infection. So that's the end of this video. I've managed to fit it into one video, so I'm quite pleased with myself. This is the second video in this series. I've previously made a video on child I, so you should check that out if you haven't seen it already. I will be going through the whole series, everything that was mentioned in the Times article and by the lawyers, every infant, and going through everything that was said about them. So there'll be a series of these videos. Then I'm going to make one big video, which will be all that evidence joined together, so that if you wanted to give a single link to someone saying this is all the evidence, this debunks everything in the Times article, it debunks everything in the lawyer's statement, then I'm happy to pass that on. And I'll make that video at the end after I've made all these individual ones that deal with the individual infants. But as ever, thank you for the support for previous videos. If you have any comments or queries or corrections, particularly corrections, I'm not going to issue any corrections in this video because I don't have any, but if I've made any mistakes in this video, please let me know and I will correct them. And it's taken me a while to have the time to make this video because I've been doing some stuff related to my book. Had to do some travelling and speak to some people, but that's all been very worthwhile. And I'm just kind of finishing some stuff off, and then eventually I'll be able to tell people more about it. But at the moment, it's still in the... I mean, I've finished the writing, but we're still working on the kind of publication phase, which I can't tell you too much about currently, but there is some good stuff happening in the background that I will reveal when I can. But that's all I have to say about Child O. As I say, if you have any comments, queries, etc., please do leave them. And I was supposed to say, I've noticed on other YouTube videos they encourage you to subscribe and like, and apparently this is good for the algorithms. So if you do want to subscribe, then I will be making lots of videos from now on. And apparently likes help the traction of the video on YouTube. There's probably other stuff. I think there's something about clicking a bell you're supposed to do, and probably some other things. But if you're watching this, you probably know more about it than me. So whatever you're supposed to do, if you want to do that, then that would be appreciated. But yeah, thank you for viewing. If you have any comments, that they would be greatly appreciated.